Hey everyone, welcome to a brand new episode of the Behold podcast on the Genre Equality channel. I'm Hitzer.
I'm Isa.
This week, we're going to take some time to talk about the many films that have inspired the many more films about Batman over the past decade. Something that I have noticed in recent times, particularly with new Batman movies, is that I have noticed that many modern filmmakers, such as Christopher Nolan or Todd Phillips, or most recently Matt Reeves, seem to just be interested in remaking their favorite iconic crime films and just trying to insert Batman characters in there. Oftentimes, Batman himself or Batman's most famous antagonist, the Joker.
Yeah.
Which is why we're going to delve into the inspirations behind these many films. Firstly, we'll talk about Michael Mann's Heat, which came out in 1995.
Yep.
It famously and quite obviously inspired The Dark Knight. Next up, we'll talk about Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver and the King of Comedy, which was mashed into an unholy amalgam, which became Todd Phillips' Joker.
Yeah.
And finally, we get David Fincher's Se7en Zodiac, which serves as almost blatant inspiration for Matt Reeves's The Batman. I am in no way saying that filmmakers should not take inspiration from previous films. I think every film takes inspiration from the director or filmmaker's favorite films.
Yeah, for sure.
It's clear and true, and I'm not knocking it for being derivative or lacking originality. The purpose of this Behold podcast is not to knock the Batman films.
Yeah.
The purpose is to make you aware of where its inspirations came from and perhaps get you to delve into these iconic movies, which, in my just personal opinion, are better than the Batman movies that it inspired. But that's up to your subjective taste.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about you, Isa? Like, which of these 5 films you think surprised you the most?
Oh man. I like Heat, Taxi Driver, classics. Watched them a couple of times. The Seven is one of my favorite kind of crime films of all time. I think the one that stands out most to me is King of Comedy, for sure, because this is my first time watching it. It was fascinating, just kind of like seeing that and like eventually doing some reading up about the whole process behind that. Like De Niro's kind of inspiration for that. The fact that this is Scorsese's favorite De Niro character, which is kind of insane, right?
Yeah.
And later on, as we kind of cover King of Comedy, and I think I do have some thoughts about that because I did rewatch Joker after rewatching Taxi Driver and watching King of Comedy, and just how that kind of impacted my opinion of Joker itself.
Which already wasn't very good.
yeah. There was just something. I mean, in comparison to, like, in direct comparison, like I immediately went from watching King of Comedy immediately to like right after I went to watch Joker. Just having that kind of like side by side comparison, or at least like the lingering thoughts and emotions from the King of Comedy going into Joker. Wow, I have a lot to say about that. So we'll dive into that when it becomes relevant, for sure.
Definitely.
But like, man, King of Comedy blew me away. Like I wasn't expecting it. Like just reading the kind of like the synopsis and what the write-up was about. It's like, okay, I can see how this feeds into the inspiration for Phillips's Joker. But oh my god, the movie in and of itself is brilliant in so many ways, and we'll get to that once we jump into that topic.
Definitely. My favorite of the 5 is Heat, which is our first topic.
Yeah.
So, let's delve into that. Heat obviously inspired Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight, and I think directors often have their cast and crew watch specific films before entering production. There's this famous story on There Will Be Blood where Paul Thomas Anderson screened The Treasure of Sierra Madre because it contained the tone of desperate greed that Anderson was striving for in his own film. Before shooting Rogue One, Gareth Edwards had his team watch a list of films including The Bridge over River Kwai and 12 O'Clock High to show them the kind of war flick he was aiming for.
Yeah.
It wasn't just going to be a normal Star Wars, it was a war movie. And just before the production began on the second installment of Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy, The Dark Knight, he had his production hits and cinematographers watch Michael Mann's Heat. Yes, there are obvious parallels between the Joker, between The Dark Knight
Yeah.
and Heat
Mhm.
in the form of the bank robberies that open both films,
Yeah.
or the concept of a small paramilitary force operating within the limits of a major city. But it wasn't necessarily the specifics of plot and character that interested Nolan in Michael Mann's films.
Mhm.
In Nolan's own words, I'm quoting him here, I always felt Heat to be a remarkable demonstration of how you can create a vast universe within one city
Yeah.
and balance a very large number of characters and their emotional journeys in an effective manner. There are visual parallels between The Dark Knight and Heat, but most remarkably is the tonal parallels, how it is shot, how Gotham City for the first time feels like a real city.
Yeah.
Heat. Not only is Heat included in this also, but obviously, Christopher Nolan also pointed out LA Takedown, which Heat is based on or adapted from. Just a quick insider side note thing: Heat is a remake. If you guys did not know, Heat is a remake of Michael Mann's TV pilot called LA Takedown,
Mhm.
which was critically panned and commercially panned. Basically everyone hated it, from the network executives to Joe Schmo on the couch back in the early 90s or late 80s, whenever it was. Michael Mann decided that it wasn't his fault, that it was the actor's fault,
Mhm.
which seems very egocentric of him. But then when he assembled a cast made up of Val Kilmer and Al Pacino and Robert De Niro, it turned out it really wasn't his fault. It was the actor's fault, because once he got good actors in the film, suddenly it became an amazing film. All you have to do is watch the famous iconic diner scene, confrontation between Al Pacino and Robert De Niro, and see how it's done with two different mediocre TV actors.
Mhm.
Just the wide gulf in quality is there, and it's down to the acting capabilities. Two legends and two mediocre actors are vastly different, obviously. What struck you the most about Heat? I know it's been a while since you've seen it. I watch Heat like every couple of years, so
Yeah.
it's very fresh in my mind. But what about you, who hasn't seen Heat for a long time? What sticks out to you
Oh
most?
man, so
And how it relates to The Dark Knight?
yeah, I don't think I immediately. I mean, I knew that Nolan drew kind of like inspiration for that, right? But rewatching Heat this time around, I think the last time I watched Heat was maybe like, oh man, maybe 10 years ago. But,
A long time,
yeah, but
right?
now it's on
Yeah.
Netflix, so I'm kind of like putting them on and revisiting that. It's like, oh man, just like I think this is peak Al Pacino, peak De Niro, right?
Mhm.
Just kind of at the height of their powers, kind of like cresting in their careers, and just before they start to play like strange versions of themselves in all other films to come.
Yeah.
And it's just like that intense kind of like uh character acting that permeates throughout this entire film, right? Like it's so
Mhm.
easy to forget these now extremely famous, extremely popular actors, and just be lost in the characters that they're playing here.
Yeah.
So many quotable quotes, so many amazing lines, right? We were
Mhm.
joking about the great ass line.
Great big
Great big
ass.
ass, and like
Yeah.
that scene still cracks me up. I
Yeah.
bust out laughing for that, just because like it felt so out of place, but so apt at the same time, right?
Mm.
And it's kind of nuts. Heat is, oh man, just the way in which the script balances who we follow, right? Not in
Mhm.
terms of just like the actual situations that surrounding them or their actual character journeys and stuff. It's so well balanced and climaxes at the point with the diner scene, right? That
Mhm.
at that point you don't take sides, right?
Mm.
And it's so crazy. And I think this is the first time I realized how little De Niro actually says at the table, in
Mhm.
compared to Pacino. And it's just that weird kind of like head tilted, chin down, kind of like eyes up look that he classically has owned right over the years. That is
Mhm.
so effective in conveying a myriad of just like emotions and kind of like the character itself while Al Pacino is just going on and on. Fucking love it. Fucking love it. And like that is just one of the very, very small ways that you can see how great actors can bring a script to life, right? After watching Heat, I went to watch the YouTube clip of LA Takedown. Man, I couldn't get through it. Right? Like it's
Yeah.
so vastly different. And like just all round, an amazing cast, an amazing soundtrack as well. And just like amazing kind of like storytelling in terms of its pacing, in terms of its tension building, in terms of its world building. Yeah, I gotta give it to Michael Mann, man. Like seriously, it is a classic for a reason. And if you guys haven't watched it, you're missing out.
Yeah, the film is sort of set as this immovable force meets, the what was that? What was the phrase?
Immovable
Immovable
object,
force,
unstoppable force.
unstoppable force. That's right.
Yeah.
That's the phrase I was going for. Or to put it more simply, it's about forces in opposition, but with no clear good guy or bad guy. It's a series of points and counterpoints. Similar to Batman and Joker, which was kind of the perfect thematic parallel between the two films.
Yeah.
It follows the cop played by Al Pacino and the bank robber criminal played by Robert De Niro. Good and bad, light and dark, and throughout Heat, Michael Mann is telling these stories in parallel, underscoring their similarities with scenes, conflicts, and characters, serving as direct complements to each other. This careful character construction and its balance of screen time and sympathy is why the now legendary diner scene in which the cop and criminal sit down for coffee and conversation, carries so much weight.
Yeah.
Like you pointed out, like neither raises their voice, neither loses their cool. They speak from a place of almost mutual respect, even affection, you might call.
Yeah.
It's like a first date, two people marveling over all that they have in common. I do what I do best. I take down scores. De Niro says, you do what you do best. Try to stop guys like me. I don't know how to do anything else. Pacino says to which, De Niro replies, neither do I. I don't much want to.
Yeah.
It's great. That's the whole movie in one exchange. But that equal distribution of narrative weight and sympathy isn't present in LA Takedown. But it's present here. Fantastic stuff, What do you think about... There are a lot of movies about cops and robbers, cat and mouse chases and stuff like that. But I think Michael Mann's Heat is the pinnacle of that type of crime movie. What do you think about that particular aspect of it?
I think if we look at, especially kind of like heist movies in the modern era, right? If we're talking in the last kind of like 15 years of filmmaking, so much of the time is spent on either side of the fence, right? You're either like largely sympathetic towards the hero because he gets a large part of the narrative time span, right? Or like in stuff like Ocean's 11, right? Like you kind of like lean a lot more towards, whoever's doing the heist itself. Right, and that goes all the way to like Public Enemy and so on and so forth. I'm not sure exactly if we get that same kind of balance in The Dark Knight itself, right? The balance there is largely due to the fact that Batman gets a lot of screen time, and Heath Ledger's amazing Joker performance like kind of balances that out with whatever screen time he is given.
Correct, yeah.
And so I mean, like, while it feels like balance, like there's nothing that comes close to kind of this distribution that's there, and like we haven't seen anyone kind of like dance that dance as well as Mann did with Heat. It is a curious thing, given that Heat is the inspiration for so many of these movies, or at least they aspire to that. But as we kind of bring up, like they're all just kind of cosplaying. Not that there's anything wrong with cosplaying, but they're just playing pretend at a story like Heat. In my mind, I don't really recall another movie that has achieved that kind of fidelity when it comes to balancing out like opposing parties or opposing factions.
I think the closest that I've ever come across was Hell or High Water.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah.
That's the closest that comes to the distribution of power that you see in Heat. Because we follow Jeff Bridges and his Native American partner as much as we follow Chris Pine and his brother. And yeah, this is actually the first time this highly charged crime thriller is actually the first time we ever see the on-screen pairing of uber thespians, De Niro and Pacino.
Yeah.
They have been in a movie together before, The Godfather Part 2, most notably, but they played the same character in different timelines in The Godfather Part 2, so they were never able to interact. So just the interactions between De Niro and Pacino already is in itself a tantalizing prospect.
Yeah.
That Michael Mann's film is, an extraordinarily intelligent and stylish and violent and realistic study of moral decay and human nature in Los Angeles, makes it doubly cool. That's the cream on top of an already great cake, and Heat proves one thing is absolute. If you put great actors in a great script with a great visionary director in control, then you get a great movie. It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
Mann, as a writer and as a director, has concocted this great duel between two mercurial forces, characters, and the battleground is LA, sort of shorn of glamour.
Yeah.
This is not LA as we see in many other movies. It is a moody, expensive cityscape. It's shot in very earthly pastels. It's very Twilight. It has a lot of twisted morals and crumbling relationships and dying dreams. And compare that to your average studio movie, it could be The Surface of the Moon, so far apart. The film's sense of environment is peerless, and I think that's what Nolan was trying to capture in making Gotham City like LA in Heat, specifically. And to a lesser extent, Matt Reeves with the unnamed city in Seven, paralleled with Gotham City as well. So much of this movie is great, particularly with the bank robbery sequences.
Oh yeah.
Which we already talked about the quieter moments, but the big moments, including the opening sequence and closing sequence, the shootout on the highway and everything. It has this great blend of like really dumb action. I mean, I don't mean but I mean like dumb action that you see in blockbusters. I don't mean that in a bad way. Dumb action is great. I love Bad Boys, for example. But like a great mix of like just this intelligent themes and nuanced acting with just really big, large scale dumb action that really hits you in every way. It's the perfect movie that will appeal to cinephiles like myself or casual audiences just walking into a theater not knowing what they're getting into. It's this kind of middle brow movie that I think nobody makes anymore, and that's kind of sad.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, I do have to say, like, Mann has incredible attention to detail when it comes to doing action. I feel as well. Like, if we talk about the highway scene, I was reading like this particular thread where they're talking about like they reload when they need to reload, like they're counting the number of shots that they take, which is such a rarity in Hollywood, right? Because apparently like 20 round clips can fire like 80 bullets or something like that before they need to do that. So I really enjoy it when a movie does that, because like it adds a sort of reality to the combat that we don't always find, right? And of course the bank sequence and just like De Niro's kind of like opener with this money is not your money, you don't have to worry about that, it's guaranteed, like one of the greatest kind of like monologues in any heist, right? Just the way that they do that. I remember watching a couple months ago this I can't remember if it's Vox or maybe it was GQ, where they were talking, they got actual former bank robbers to kind of like break down the scene about how good it is, how realistic it is, whether they'll go down there, and like everyone has consistently ranked that as one of the best, most realistic and kind of like truthful bank heist scenes that they've seen. And yeah, I love the way that there's just is just all planned out, and like these guys are at the peak of what they're doing, which is robbing and doing pulling jobs and stuff like that.
Yeah. What's interesting about this also was that this movie came at a time when De Niro and Pacino were waning in their powers. Like, not necessarily that they couldn't do it anymore.
Yeah.
It's just that they seem to be, I don't know, phoning it in, particularly in the mid 90s. Michael Mann actually managed to wrangle prime Pacino and prime De Niro from like 10 years ago into this movie. You still see scenes where De Niro's like wide-eyed, bug-eyed, overacting, Cherise Newing that you see in like Scent of a Woman, the famous great big ass scene is one of those moments where he just like lapses into that. Not that I mind at all,
Yeah.
because it goes with his character. But I love that Mann was able to pull this from two actors who was clearly just like cashing checks at that point.
Yeah.
De Niro's performance in particular is a model of composure. At one point, we see him reading I recently rewatched this, so
Yeah.
I saw him reading a book right in bed or in a diner called Stress Fractures in Titanium.
Yeah.
Which encapsulates his character, which I did not notice it at the first point. Stress fractures in Titanium. That's perfect. That is what the character is. And Pacino is obviously more voluble, operating almost in the same line of borderline self-parody as he was in like Sense of a Woman or The Devil's Advocate.
Yeah.
But yoking his flamboyance smartly to the demands of the role.
Yeah.
Like whenever Vincent flies off the handle, it's always shown to be purposeful as the coping mechanism of a possibly coked up cop. It's not explicitly shown that he's coked up, but I mean that guy is definitely coked up.
Oh yeah. I mean, like given the time period it's set in, right? Like it's almost a sure bet.
Definitely, I love the way that Mann shoots. He always uses 35mm film.
Yeah.
Handheld sometimes, and I love the pathos in Mann's movies, including and especially Heat. Comes from this impossibility of reconciling individual excellence with conventional forms of security and or fulfillment.
Yeah.
He likes to go with this lone wolf archetype, and his lone wolf archetype is doubled in this movie because we have two lone wolf archetypes on opposing sides. And it's sold as this unprecedented summit of two ranking new Hollywood icons from the 90s.
Yeah.
Which is sold by that coffee date, which everyone talks about. It has this pulpy grandeur.
Yeah.
That is Mann at his most charismatic. It feels both like artistic and formal, but at the same time it feels pulpy and dumb. At the same time, and I love both sides of Heat, which is why it's one of my favorite films of all time. Any thoughts about Heat and or The Dark Knight before we move on?
Oh man, I mean, like I think we said majority of what we sung all the praises that we possibly could. And maybe we'll talk about a bit later the fact that we have so much De Niro.
So much.
Yeah, so much De Niro in general in the stuff that we're talking about in this particular episode. And that how that just kind of like pans out. But yeah, Heat, amazing thing. It makes me excited for what's Mann's vision project? Tokyo Vice?
Tokyo Vice, yeah.
Yeah, Tokyo Vice. I'm really hoping like the promotional material for that seems very Mann in terms of like just the look, the style, the sheen of it. But I'm looking for a lot more of like the coffee scene of like, Al Pacino kind of telling down like, I need to hold on to my angst, and that whole grand speech that he makes to his wife. Like, I'm hoping that Vice has a bit more of that than the promotional material is showing. But, we'll see. Fingers crossed.
Tokyo Vice is a good show with two major problems. I've seen 3 or 4 episodes at this point.
Yeah.
I've not seen the whole show, but the major problems that I counted, despite me liking the show, the major problem is that it is a story about Tokyo told from a white man's point of view. And the second major problem is that white man is Ansel Elgort.
Yeah.
So it's a bit hard to look past that, lah. But when the show delves into the Tokyo underworld, featuring Japanese characters, portrayed by Japanese actors, that's when the show is at its best.
Is it Watanabe?
Yeah, Watanabe is in it, and there's a lot of other Japanese, more unknown Japanese actors in it too, that do very, very, very good work.
Nice.
Ansel Elgort is not Pacino and or De Niro.
Yeah.
And the fact that Ansel Elgort already has this cloud looming over him with the allegations and all of that, makes it adds even more like an ick factor to it. Beyond the fact that it's like, why are we following this white guy in the Tokyo underworld?
Yeah.
The story could have been crafted around that. But anyways, whatever. Like, it was a decent show.
Okay.
You should give it a watch. But yeah, the Ansel Elgort is like not the best thing for the show. If you do get a season 2, move on to the Japanese gangsters because they're more interesting.
Definitely.
Yeah. Next up, let's move on to let's talk about this in tandem. We'll talk about Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy. 2 sides of a film that amalgamated together to make The Joker. Todd Phillips is very acclaimed I would, in my personal opinion, unfairly so, 2019 film,
Yeah.
pays homage to both unsettling classics, but I think misses their point.
Mm.
Um, about the only thing everyone agrees upon Joker is that it's the kind of remake of it's a kind of remake of the two Martin Scorsese movies, the 1976 Taxi Driver and 1982 King
Yeah.
Comedy, both of which star Robert De Niro, as does Joker, who obviously an intentional homage, right?
Yeah.
In Taxi Driver, De Niro is a delusional, self-styled vigilante, Travis Bickle, who
Mm.
is a Vietnam vet and a violent misanthrope who becomes obsessed with a campaign worker played by Sybil Shepherd, and a van underage prostitute played by Jodie Foster, her first role actually, and then ultimately his own sordid heroic fantasies. In The King of Comedy, De Niro plays Rupert Pupkin, a lousy but eternally optimistic stand-up comedian,
Yeah.
obsessed with late-night comedy host Jerry Langford, played by Jerry Lewis here, and deluded about his chances of getting on Langford's show. Pupkin and his equally obsessed friend Marsha concoct and then conduct a kidnapping to make sure their dreams come true.
Mm-hmm.
In these two movies, De Niro is playing two sides of the same coin: men who lose touch with reality and blur their own paranoid fantasies with real life.
Yeah.
What's chilling about both is that they initially present as engaged, courteous, or even genial men with a strongly developed moral sense and a genuine interest in others as humans. We are tricked, though, like the women they both pursue,
Mm-hmm.
into thinking that they are at worst ridiculous but harmless. It's only when they're rejected that their true colors start to emerge. As I mentioned, De Niro appears in Joker 2, though now as a secondary character. Here, he's in the Jerry Lewis role
Yeah.
as Murray Franklin, a late night talk show host whom future Joker Arthur Fleck, played by Joaquin Phoenix, idolizes. Like Rupert, Fleck spends hours in his home imagining being on Franklin's show.
Yeah.
When he finally gets his wish, he's humiliated by Franklin, who shows video from Fleck's disastrous stand-up routine on national TV. And like Travis Bickle, when pushed to his edge, Fleck turns violent.
Mm.
Pupkin is never violent. The gun he and Marsha threaten Langford with isn't real, but the potential for it hangs over all his actions.
Yeah.
Especially as they grow increasingly unhinged, and that's what gives them power. All three of these guys, Travis, Rupert, and Joker have plenty in common, and Joker knows it. All three of these movies coax us to watch a guy crack up, then violent, and then become a folk hero.
Mm-hmm.
And all three think they're existential heroes, men who stand alone against the pressure of the world around them, choosing to forge their own paths. Now, why does Joker fail? Why Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy succeed? That's where I'm gonna throw it to you. Yeah.
Okay. I think for me, like one of the big issues I had with Joker, right? In particular, is I've always subscribed as a fan, having read most of the major kind of Batman comics, right? Is that
Mhm.
Joker suffers from a form of hyper sanity, right?
Yeah.
Such that the conventions of society and the culture surrounding it, like that, is not important to him because he sees the world in a vastly different way from everybody else.
Mm.
And as such, that as Deus Ex as that may be, right, to explain his actions, is the reason why he does the thing he does, right? That like nothing is really of consequence in a very nihilistic way, and therefore, right, that explains the violence, that explains what he does. He is looking to entertain himself, more or less, right? With this incredibly obsession with Batman, as his
Mhm.
kind of counterpart. With Joker, we don't get that, right? It is
Yep.
the fullest. It is the realization of delusion in the Joker that we get, and I feel like, um, having watched King of Comedy and Joker back to back, right? The non-violence that we get in King of Comedy feels far more threatening and far
Mm.
more malicious than the violence that we get from Joker, right? Because it
Mm.
constantly simmers under the surface in King of Comedy, right? And having watched those two movies back to back, I felt, upon rewatching Joker, like it seems so much less potent of a movie,
Mm.
right? In terms of its themes, in terms of what it's trying to say, even in terms of like the lines that are very clearly paying homage to King of Comedy, right? It is a pale, pale comparison. Not just, and I don't think it's the actors necessarily, but just like the script and the violence that they choose to include as part of this Joker story, right, takes away from the just kind of the weight, right? Because so much of the time, like the truly horrifying or terrifying characters are the ones that are capable of a great deal of harm, but always find a way to kind of skirt that. Like they get their way without necessarily having to, shoot someone in the head, kill a bunch of men, a bunch of suits in the train, and all
Mm.
of that, right? And it feels as though the exploration with Pumpkin's delusion and the way that
Mm-hmm.
that ends feels far more satisfying, despite the fact that it's an unknown whether or not that actually happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
uh, because it feels like it sees that to its not logical, it sees it to its delusional conclusion, right?
Yep.
As part
Yep.
of that character and an extension of the story past what would be the climax and denouement of the action.
Mm-hmm.
But for Joker, you don't get that, right? It is what it is. It sets it up. It becomes a prequel to whatever kind of like universe like Todd Phillips is creating in his head with the inclusion of this Batman character, right? And
Mm.
and it doesn't work because Batman isn't there, right? It doesn't work
Mm.
because as a origin story, it does not it misses out on like the two big things: the fact that number one, that Joker isn't delusional, right?
Mm-hmm.
For most intents and purposes, if you're talking about like the comic books or so many other different iterations of the character, right? And there is no counterpart to that, you know.
Yep.
And that for me is why Joker fails to capture what I think is the essence of that particular character and turns it into a facsimile of the King of Comedy slash Taxi Driver.
Yeah, it captures the visual aesthetic of Taxi Driver and the King of Comedy and the storylines or arcs of the King of
Yeah.
Comedy and Taxi Driver without actually getting into the meat of the thematic meaning
Yeah.
of what Scorsese was trying to get to. Just because Joker succeeds in looking like these films, it doesn't mean that films also manage to convey their original meaning.
Mhm.
Scorsese has always been an empathetic filmmaker, first and foremost. And Phillips has shown that his first foray into dark, character-centric storytelling,
Mhm.
that his disposition as a filmmaker is much more cynical and cold than Scorsese's was.
Yeah.
By presenting us with a narrative bereft of comedy, without a clear voice of reason, in a world that is as unironic as it is disturbing, Joker functions as a Scorsese movie devoid of Scorsese's most important quality, the humanity.
Yeah.
I think Phillips manages to capture Scorsese's spirit without its soul,
Mm.
making Joaquin Phoenix's admittedly amazing performance
yeah.
or take on the villain
Mhm.
feel less like the clown prince of crime and more like a Frankenstein's monster of 80s and 70s Scorsese movie references.
Yeah.
That's where it feels, and it's kind of sad, lah. When you look at Travis Bickle and Pumpkin as characters, all three characters in all three movies are in their early 30s, early in their careers, and their pathology that simmers under Bickle's surface seems born of something uncomfortably familiar. I think something that we all understand.
Mhm.
The King of Comedy spots the same feeling of uneasy lived-in knowingness,
Yeah.
although it's I think Pumpkin's destructive impulse seems more bent on glory-seeking self-humiliation
Mhm.
in the limelight rather than hurting anyone. Familiar territory once again.
Yeah.
Pumpkin's line as he's led away from Langford set in handcuffs is better to be king for a night than a schmuck for a lifetime.
Mhm.
Rings true, but in a way that's only gotten more distressing in the years since,
Yeah.
especially considering the comedy scene today.
Yeah.
Um, Biko, on the other hand, unlike Pumpkin, who has kind of, but I think because King of Comedy has become such an underseen classic,
Yeah.
that he never quite gained the fan base that Travis Bickle has. Travis Bickle seems to have a fan base that kind of misses the point of Travis Bickle and seems to admire him.
Yeah.
I think this thriving fan base is presumably made up of the same guys who idolize Tyler Durden.
Yeah.
On the internet, you can find all kinds of fan art, featuring like Bickel, featuring Bickel, like handmade posters and wall tapestries and stuff like that. And I think most guys who went to school or college probably had a friend who had a photo of the infamous mohawk in their room or something.
Yeah.
Bickel comes across as cool, and Pumpkin comes across as a schmuck, and both men are hailed as heroes by the people in the end, but only Bickel has gotten away with murder.
Mhm.
And yet maybe we can't help but feel some kind of sympathy or kinship for both Bickel and Pumpkin.
Yeah.
Lonely men who the world does not wish to treat kindly. Both movies take their power from how they toy with us, kind of never telegraphing whether or not we're supposed to feel this,
Yeah.
and then showing by the end definitely that the people who elevate Travis Bickle and Robert Pumpkin to the status of heroes are fools, which is to say that if we idolize them, we are also fools.
Mhm.
And Joker inspires a very different audience reactions than his heroes.
Yeah.
The film is explicitly inspired by both. Scorsese himself is a producer on both. He was very hands off with it,
Yeah.
but presumably, he had some input into Todd Phillips' story. It's complicated, but I think Todd Phillips just doesn't capture it because he doesn't capture the humanity of both characters, as I mentioned,
Yeah.
by mashing them together into one tale
Mhm.
and removing most of the film's humor and irony. We are left with a movie that can't quite get a handle on its protagonist the way that Scorsese's two films managed to.
Yeah.
And that's complicated by wrapping up the Bickle Pumpkin avatar into the skin of the Joker, who comes with his own baggage,
Yes.
who comes with his own history, and who has himself become a meme for the internet's angry man elements and fringe.
Mhm.
It's at the same time fitting that he would make the Joker like Taxi Driver and the King of Comedy, but at the same time not.
Yeah.
It's hard to really do with Fleck and what the King of Comedy did with Pumpkin when the Joker's biggest fans veer awfully close to a Pumpkin type with Bickle-like aspirations. It's very sad for Fleck and his eventual Joker evolution, and the resulting character is just a pathetic victim.
Yeah.
And we know what we're supposed to feel for him, pity. That's signaled throughout the movie loud and clear. He's beaten up, abandoned, mocked, and mistaken.
Yep.
But unlike Bickle and Pumpkin, when Fleck finally finds himself through violence, it reads unequivocally as a moment of self-actualization.
Mhm.
You're supposed to cheer like, he did it, guys. He finally overcame his oppressors and came to his own. Sure, you can condemn his actions, but then aren't you the bad guy too? This is the weird cognitive dissonance that Todd Phillips didn't get from his two inspirations.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't know. I want to get your take on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, like it. We have to be very careful. I think, like when we're watching something like Joker, what is being shown, does it actually humanize Fleck's character? Right. His struggle and the abuse that he kind of goes through, the kind of revelations that we get from his childhood and all of that, right? They seem to hit the same beats as like Bickle's kind of PTSD, or kind of like the delusional psychosis that Pumpkin has. Like they ring the same, but they're not the same, right? There aren't really moments in which we see Fleck as a truly vulnerable human as much as a victim, right? And I think that to me is an important distinction to make. In terms of like the decisions he makes and stuff like that, like it all has the shades of what we saw in Taxi Driver and what we see in King of Comedy, but it's not the fullness of how human a person can be, right? And as a result of that, when he overcomes his oppressor, when he is no longer a victim and becomes the perpetrator, right? It's not the same as Bickle going into kind of like rescue Iris, right? It's not the same as taking that moment, a Pumpkin taking that moment on stage, that 10 minutes of fame, to say something that is his truth, because we don't get that with Joker, right? Like he never has that moment. The actualization is not self-realization. If that makes sense, right? So I don't know, like it's hard to kind of break it down in that way, because the way that Joker is paced, right? Like it's one thing after another, one thing after another. There isn't really enough time for the character to breathe and to come to terms with those things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And whereas for both Biko and Pumpkin, like there are these moments of clarity within the film itself that give us the space to say like, okay, like this is who he is as he is at this point in time, and therefore all actions he takes after this stem from that. I'm not sure if we get the same thing with Joker.
Yep.
Additionally, right, Joker
Yep.
suffers from the fact that the Joker character comes with its own baggage. And this
Mm.
looming thing over the movie is the fact that Heath Ledger did it better.
Yep.
Right? Right. And we've just talked about The Dark Knight and all of that and Heat, right? But at the end of the day, like to me, as far as live action goes, like Ledger's Joker is as close to the source material as it gets, right?
Yep.
Hyper intelligent, hyper sane, chaotic because he wants to be chaotic. You know, it feels as though like Heath's Joker is never angry. He's never disenfranchised because he doesn't care about any of that, right? Like he doesn't pay attention to the rules because the rules don't apply to him as far as he's concerned, and that makes him so much more threatening against against Batman, against his counterpart. But while Fleck rages against the system that has him under his thumb and all of that, like that just rings false, right? He doesn't feel as much of a force of nature like Heath's Joker does, and more just like a celebrated someone who eventually becomes celebrated for enacting violence and acting out. Which in and of itself is a problematic kind of thing, right? Like I feel if we were to extend the logic with that and eventually have a Batman in Phillips's universe, right? Like it's not gonna work, right? Batman's gonna trounce this Joker like any time of the day just because like it's not the same motivations, it's not the same kind of like drama behind that. The character just isn't built the same way to withstand kind of vengeance, right? As we go into the next movie.
Yeah, definitely. I think both the King of Comedy and Joker and of course Taxi Driver are very much alike. The sad clowns manage to become massively successful as comedians, and offering kind of this commentary on how the media landscape both oppresses and idealizes outsiders.
Yeah.
But what makes the King of Comedy so effective, more so than Joker, is that it is human in its commentary, and the film is actually hilarious. Not in a laugh out loud, knee slapping way, but in a kind of darkly acerbic, ironic sense that makes it impossible to take seriously. Like one look at Pumpkin, a character whose name is constantly mistaken for Pumpkin, something that I almost like do also when I'm doing this review, will have you chuckling at the sheer stupidity of it all. And the Joker is just not like that. His plight as a mentally ill loner is so tragic, yet also so repulsive that when he succeeds in the end, it's unclear if the audience is supposed to be disgusted or happy with him. That's a distinction that is not in Taxi Driver or The King of Comedy, because that distinction is made clear by Martin Scorsese. I mean, down to like the small things, like Phillips's reliance on a Frank Sinatra soundtrack is also something that brings Scorsese to mind. Even little things, and that song that frequently plays, the 1966 Sinatra recording of Dad's life. The song tells a simple story of a man who's continually knocked down in life but always gets back on his horse. By playing it so much and by having Joaquin Phoenix even mouth the words of the song in the film's ending, we are left with the idea that this song seems to represent the message that Phillips is seeking to send to the audience. Sure, Fleck is knocked down a whole lot in Joker, and he manages to bounce back. But after all the shooting and stabbing and killing and carnage and crying, it's all presented without morals in Phillips's film. Joker doesn't feel like a story of redemption or of warning at all. It feels like a gradual loss of humanity. And for Scorsese, the filmmaker who once called movies an act of faith, I think all the references in Phillips's film don't feel like homages. They actually feel like blasphemy to me. Which is why I feel, in the end, the film that most closely matches in terms of quality its source material is The Dark Knight, as you were talking about, right? The Dark Knight most closely matches Heat in terms of quality. The one that is furthest apart of all of these is Joker and the Scorsese
Yeah.
films, I think.
Yeah.
Something that falls in the middle of them both, neither too great or neither too bad, as we have talked about in our review,
Yeah.
is Matt Reeves's The Batman.
Yes.
Man, probably more so than Joker or The Dark Knight.
Mhm.
Matt Reeves wears his influences more blatantly than the other two Batman
Yeah.
films.
Uh-huh.
Like from the moment Matt Reeves came aboard the Batman, right? The conversation from interviews to trailers has been on the director's influences, his inspirations. You know, Reeves and Robert Pattinson have spoken at length about their many sources of inspiration, which effectively sets the Batman apart from past iterations. In a sense, yeah, the film absolutely sets the Batman apart from past inspiration from past iterations. But the Batman itself, how do I describe this? The Batman is more of a David Fincher mood board than an actual movie, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It's just David Fincher things thrown together. And yeah, that's about it. Okay, let me describe like Seven and Zodiac. If you've never seen Seven and Zodiac, you'll probably be like, what the fuck? Watch Seven and Zodiac.
Please do.
The influences and the stuff that is directly copied is just so blatant that you can't miss it.
Yeah.
It's not something subtle like The Dark Knight and Heat, which is actually not that subtle, to be honest.
Yeah.
Or but Reeves definitely took a page or two from David Fincher's book on world building, and the Batman is, I guess, a little better for it. Like the rundown streets of Gotham seem caked in the same grime as the unnamed city in Seven, which could be Gotham City as well. I've always, in my head canon, always considered it Gotham. Kevin Spacey's serial killer seems made for Gotham. It has this perpetual downpour. It's always raining, a fixture in both films, and the downpour can never wash away the city's filth. It can never make it clean. There's perpetual darkness. Batman embodies the shadows of Gotham as a means to keep criminals in check. And, the cinematographer for the Batman, Greg Fraser, kind of wields that to the same effect. Like Seven and so many other crime thrillers, the Batman avoids any light that feels natural. Like Bruce Wayne himself, the film's perpetual darkness forces us all to be nocturnal animals. I think the Batman also, one of the bright spots of Batman is that it scores big points for, I think, scaling back the titular hero's resources. Bruce Wayne is in year 2 of his exploits, which means he has to lean more on his talent for sleuthing than fancy gadgets or allies. In the Batman, Bruce Wayne has Lieutenant James Gordon on his side, which adds to the film feeling of being overwhelmed in this sea of corruption and crime. And the good cop, crazy cop dynamic has been hashed out in countless detective films over the years. The relationship between Batman and Jim Gordon owes a lot to Seven, because of Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman's character dynamic too. Then there's also the film's killer John Doe, his cryptic MO, his diaries and journals, which is strongly reminiscent of yet another Fincher film, Zodiac, this time based on real life. On the big screen, Riddler has kind of become synonymous with Jim Carrey's iteration. When you say Riddler, people think of that version, right? The pink hat, scenery chewing iteration from Batman Forever. Depending on who you ask, his campy take translates effortlessly into any Batman film. But Matt Reeves was keen to take the character in another direction. In many, many interviews, he has said the Zodiac Killer was the real world analogy that he used to ground this particular member of Batman's rogues gallery from the duct tape, his crudely made costume, the ciphers that Zodiac leaves behind, all the cryptic ciphers that the real world detectives have trouble cracking, but Batman does crack. The Riddler's re-establishment as a serial killer is one of the key ways that the Batman grounded its story. And it was important for Reeves to strike a balance between that and the scope of a superhero film. But it is, in the end, still a film about cosplaying crime fighters. So there were a lot of outlandish influences that counteracted what he wanted to do in terms of copying the vibe and tone of Seven and Zodiac. Having re-seen Seven and Zodiac recently, how blatant were the influences to you, and what do you catch from what Matt Reeves was trying to take from both movies, and was he successful?
Okay. Wow, where do we start? This is actually a lot of things to pick out. Let's talk
Mm.
about the unnamed city in Seven and Gotham first,
Yep, yep, yep.
right? I feel like again, right, it captures the look and the feel of it, right? Like the fact
Mm.
that it's worn down, it's downtrodden, it's hopeless, it feels cynical, it feels cold, it feels uncaring.
It's
Both,
always raining.
and it's always raining. Like both were either always raining or always kind of like dark, right? And misty
Mm-hmm.
and obscured in a way where like there's no visual acuity for either film.
Yeah, yeah.
uh, which I get and which I understand and which works for the Batman for sure.
Mm-hmm.
However, I feel as though we don't get enough time with non lead characters in the Batman to really see how the city wears them down, right?
Yes,
It's
yes. That's
such
the
a
perfect
huge
point to make. Yeah.
such a huge point, especially when we're talking about Paltrow's character in Seven, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
Brad Pitt's wife, and just like how she is struggling as a new kind of like uh person, and that really important diner scene where she sits down with Morgan Freeman's character,
Mm-hmm.
and just talks about how it's affecting her and how it's wearing her down, how she's terribly afraid of the fact
Mm.
of raising a child in this city, right? And how like she's terrified of how it's affecting Mills's character and Mills's kind of like drive to do something good in the city. We don't get that with the
Mm.
Gotham in the Batman, and I think that is a wasted kind of opportunity, right? All the minor characters, even from Gordon himself, right? Like you don't sense that hopelessness, you don't sense that despair, and because of
Mm.
that, it feels as though the Riddler is far less interesting or motivated a character than John Doe is as a villain, right?
Mm.
Because like you immediately understand what John Doe is talking about, right? Like Spacey's amazing kind of performance in the third act of the film.
Mm-hmm.
You sympathize, you understand why he's taking the stance that he's taken, right?
Yep.
Much in the same way, like for the Zodiac killer as well, right? Like it's well explained, and it's understandable given enough context of the world at the time, why they do
Mm-hmm.
the things they do, why they explain the way they explain, why they preach the way that they preach. To
Yep.
borrow from Somerset's kind of like very insightful analysis of what John Doe is doing. Uh,
Mm.
but for Riddler, it doesn't feel that way, right? Like I
Yep.
feel like Reeves's Riddler takes too much from Joker's plate.
Sure.
if
Yeah.
that makes sense, right? Like you have these two actors, right? And I mean, with the fact that we have Barry Keoghan's Joker kind of looming on the edge of that as
Mm-hmm.
well, just makes the two characters seem like extremely conflated. They feel like one character possibly, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um as opposed to like the very clearly defined campy Jim Carrey Riddler, right? Who,
Mm.
despite all his camp, who, despite all the shenanigans, who, despite the ridiculous green latex outfit, right, is extremely effective in what he does.
Yep.
It,
In terms of distincting of being of identifying himself distinctly.
yes, exactly, right? Like
Yeah.
as a villain, branding on point, right? This one branding
Mm.
not clear at all. Sure, you live riddles, but does that make you the Riddler necessarily,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
And it feels less compelling that way because I think like Batman, by and large, is really defined by his rogues gallery, right?
Mm.
And I think like the Dark Knight is a very clear vision of that, and then less
Yep.
so, when Bane shows up. Yeah. So again, like the context is missing for Gotham in the Dark Knight.
Mm.
We don't see enough of the city, quite literally, and how it affects its people for
Yeah.
it to set up that way, right? Like, sure, there's an orphanage, right? And it's different because you were an orphan with privilege and I was an orphan without privilege and all of that. Sure, but it doesn't show me like the greater context of that, right? And I think it's a missed opportunity to spend more time with Gordon, maybe, right? Just to kind of elucidate that for the audience.
Yeah, yeah. I feel that Matt Reeves almost expects his audience to have seen Seven and to assume that Seven is the same city. He's just setting it there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the comparisons, especially with you've already touched upon most of the Seven comparisons. One of the biggest comparisons with Zodiac isn't just the ciphers that the Riddler leaves. That's quite blatant, but it's also this idea of obsessive sleuthing of obsessed detectives who can't go beyond the mystery and can't live their lives. It's a missed opportunity in that aspect as well, because the film doesn't cover Batman's obsession, or it doesn't feel as unhealthily obsessive, because he's trying to save lives and all that. He's doing this for a good reason, right? And so are the detectives in Zodiac, but I think Fincher manages to capture the dark side of that better. I want to touch upon like the two films, I guess, independent of the Batman. David Fincher's first film is not Seven.
No.
Fincher's first film is The Horrendous Alien Tree, directed by him and written by Joss Whedon. You would think that would be a match made in heaven, dream pairing when both were early in their careers and in their primes, right?
Yeah.
But I think 20th Century Fox meddling seems to have driven David Fincher out of big budget studio filmmaking for the rest of his career. This botched production is man, there are books written about it. You should go read it. I have.
Okay.
But Seven is where Fincher's filmography truly begins, and it's fitting for a director who kind of identifies himself as a cynic, and that he should lead a movie that abhors human nature, massacres the good in more ways than one, and even feels a slight reverence towards its heinous killer. There's a beauty to the cruelty as the movie presents a stylized realism that taps into a rotting, fetid world, but does so without establishing a particular locale, drenching the unnamed city in rain and sinking the shots into darkness and low angles. Seven is where David Fincher really came out to play. Alien 3 was kind of this big budget studio trap, and he finally freed himself from it. There's so much of it that the Batman takes inspiration from, including the meeting of John Doe almost at the end of the film. Like, we don't meet John Doe, played by Kevin Spacey, until the third act. But Fincher brings us right into his mind with the opening credits. The cold open itself is a somber prologue to the evil we're about to witness, but there's this artfulness to John Doe's technique. In the commentary track, Fincher argues that Doe has more enthusiasm than technique, but I beg to differ. Somerset agrees that something like keeping the sloth victim alive for a year takes incredible will, but it can't be done without technique. Doe is certainly zealous, but he's also precise, exacting, almost completely uncompromising, unless backed into a corner, at which point he still makes it work to his advantage. This description obviously matches the Riddler, but Fincher managed to take us into the mind of John Doe and his psychosis, or his I don't know the actual medical term for it, but whatever his mental illness is. He manages to make us feel that the revulsion towards that without seeing John Doe, in a way that Matt Reeves didn't make me feel for the Riddler. Do you feel the same way? Like, I was never scared of the Riddler or scarred by the Riddler in the way that I was scarred by John Doe.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think like the intentionality behind every murder that John Doe does, right, is so specific and so well thought out, right? And it's not just because like, he's read Paradise Lost, he's referring to, the cardinal sins and all of that. Like it is genuine kind of like puzzles. Like when John Doe flexes, he's really flexing, right? Everything that the Riddler throws at the Batman gets solved like that. It's a non-issue, right?
Maybe because they're simple riddles which anyone in the audience could guess themselves. Not the world's greatest detective.
Exactly, right? And like we've had multiple conversations about this, right? Like so few iterations of the Batman have ever come close to tackling the fact that at the end of the day, his superpower, more than anything else, is that he's the world's greatest detective. And strangely enough, the closest that we've seen of that is Ben Affleck's Bruce Wayne. Right? Which I think is a shame. It really, really is a shame. Like, when your villain, especially in a Batman movie, is not up to par, right? It makes it that much poorer of a movie, and when you say you're drawing from like something like Seven or something like Zodiac, Like these puzzles, these riddles, these questions, these ciphers are man hours, tons and tons of man hours are spent of that. People are obsessed with it. People dedicate their lives to solving it, right? And then you just solve it in like one-liners, and in the end, like your amazing second, third act is uncovered by, the fact that some
Catwoman.
by cat okay, brought to you by Catwoman, and then the
Yeah.
entire unnecessary extra plot is because some cop's dad happened to be a upholstery guy. Like,
Yeah.
oh man, what a cheap cop out, seriously. Like,
Yeah.
man. Again, like, guys, we've already reviewed the Batman, so if you want, please go check out
The last episode of Genre Equality. Yeah.
for all of that.
I mean, I guess what the Riddler should have done is make his riddles in Spanish, and because Batman doesn't seem to understand very basic fundamental Spanish. It's weirdly his kryptonite
Yeah.
in this film or in this universe he just doesn't understand Spanish. It just so fails to capture. It captures the style and tone of Seven without capturing the real grotesqueness or the real feeling of dread that Seven captures. John Doe is a far better villain than the Riddler is. Detectives Somerset and Mills are far more interesting protagonists than Bruce Wayne is. And the Seven is in a way timeless. Because you almost don't know what period it's set in. There's no pop culture ads. I mean, Somerset uses a typewriter, but that could be a character quirk because everyone else in the precinct uses computers. It could be set in any time, you know. And I think that's what Fincher is trying to do, because he's trying to tell us that sin is timeless. Sin has always been there, and the nature of the grotesqueness of his crimes, how nauseating they are, particularly gluttony, sloth, and lust, are stuff that are burned into my mind. In a way that I guess the Batman either didn't want to depict because it was a PG-13. Was it? Yes, it was a PG-13 film, and parents are going to be bringing their kids to watch a Batman movie. It just feels like a very handicapped version of what he's trying to copy or trying to take inspiration from.
Just as a testament
go.
to how amazing Seven is, right? I've watched Seven so many times. But the final climax, the final act, right, and how it culminates in the field always gets me. It always gets me how brilliant that plan is, and how heightened the emotional dilemma must be for everybody involved, for Somerset, for Mills, for John Doe himself, right? Like that is Seven is a masterclass in tension building. All throughout the entire film, and for it to culminate into a nearly perfect scene, right, where everything that has been simmering below the surface for the audience, everything when it comes to understanding John Doe and his intentionality in the grotesqueness of what he's doing, in the violence that he's perpetuating, and what he's saying as a commentary about the society that these men are living in. Right. And the eventual decisions that these detectives make or try at very least to fight against. Like, I mean, that is so good, so amazing. And it gets me every time, despite the fact that I've watched Seven maybe 20 times already. And we don't get any of that in the Batman, unfortunately. And I think I think the first time we talked about it, we talked about the Batman, is like it's Fincher cosplay, unfortunately, right? Again, nothing wrong with cosplay, guys. Love cosplay, but it's pretending. But that being said, it is still one of the best Batman movies we've got. So
absolutely. And when you want to talk about detective narratives, right? Perhaps especially in the detective aspect of it, no other Fincher film manages to capture that. Not even Seven, as well as Zodiac does. With a runtime of nearly 3 hours, this film feels almost unbelievably swift. It is a film that supercharges every minute with a maximum of minutiae. You know what I mean? It is maximum minutiae every minute. It is dizzyingly dense and intricate in the extreme. Zodiac is the most information-packed procedural, I've seen since All the President's Men or JFK, and far more restrained, though, when it comes to theorizing. The screenplay, which was meticulously written by James Vanderbilt, had been adapted from a pair of books by Robert Graysmith, who is
Hmm.
played in the film here by Jake
Yeah.
Gyllenhaal, who was a cartoonist at the Chronicle, who kind of glommed onto the Zodiac case and eventually took it on as his life's work. Everything has been checked against verifiable sources, then staged with the utmost fidelity and precision. Note how Fincher resists dramatizing the events in Paul Stein's Cab,
Oh
where the
yeah.
cab driver was shot,
Yeah.
and he sticking to a representation of his known route. The result is kind of this like orgy of empiricism, an orgy of empirical evidence, a monumental geek fest of fact checking, speculation, deduction, code breaking, note taking, forensics, graphology, fingerprint analysis, warrants wrangling, witness testimony, phone calls, news reports. Um, uh, I felt as a viewer like I was stuck in a filing cabinet for 3 hours, and I meant that as a compliment. It's a remarkable feat of concentration. Zodiac is the most fully mature triumph of detective
Yeah.
stories for all the reasons that I mentioned. Do you agree?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for me, I think it wasn't so much a filing cabinet necessarily,
Mm.
but it definitely felt like one of those like red thread conspiracy rooms. Oh man, I
Mm.
fucking love that. Just the fact that I feel like I'm tangled up, right, with
Yeah.
all the things that are presented to you, and as I watch these men struggle to
Mm.
uncover this and the cost at which it comes at to their personal lives and their families and so on and so forth and careers, um,
Mm.
like that in and of itself is, I feel at a loss, right? Like I understand that there is no real way to find at the truth, and it eats as me as someone who's watching these men do it, particularly Gyllenhaal's character. I
Mm.
understand why he's driven to this obsession because with everything that's presented to you, with everything that's thrown at you, with everything that's uncovered or unknown or uncertain, right? Like it
Yep.
adds an extra degree of frustration as an audience member that is captured so remarkably by Fincher and the actors,
Mm.
that I get it. I know why you would throw your family away for you to write this book, right? I
Mm-hmm.
understand why all of that happens, you know. And being able to do that in the most subtle of ways, right? Like it's never going out and say, "Oh yeah, I am frustrated with this," right? Like it's all showing, it's not telling. Um,
Yes. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
makes it is a masterclass in the art form of that, in the
Mm.
medium of film, to be able to elicit those emotions without ever broaching it outright, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's even quite different for Fincher because I think Fincher tends to be quite operatic in his films, like very big emotions, massive denouements, portentousness, flamboyance. And Zodiac, by contrast, is very coolly calibrated. It's very detached. It's mathematically precise. Capable of great variety and nuance, and controlled by a strict discipline. It's a film that never raises its voice in the way that Seven does because it needs to speak clearly and carefully, and it's got a hell of a lot to say. Fincher has always said that he's just wanted to tell a good story, and mission accomplished. It's that very lack of pretense coupled with a determination to get the facts down with maximum economy and
Yeah.
objectivity that gives Zodiac its hard, bright integrity.
Mm.
It's a crime saga. It's also a newspaper drama. It's also a period piece, and it works just fine in all three respects. But the thing that it works best at is an allegory of life in the information age.
Mm.
In that respect, I think the film is at its most successful. The medium is the message in Zodiac.
Yeah.
A serial killer flick that isn't really about the serial killer. It's a procedural key to the psychology of procedure
Yeah.
more than the man engaged in it.
Yeah.
How many times have we seen quote unquote the genre is called procedurals? Right? How many times have we seen procedurals that pay no attention to procedure? All the time. Nearly every procedural on TV or in
Yeah.
film pays no attention to actual procedure.
Yeah.
This film more is not about a serial killer or even detectives or even obsession. This film is about procedure. Zodiac is about information systems of bewildering complexity laid out for our contemplation.
Mm-hmm.
It's an epic reflective analysis of how one canny lunatic triggered an all-consuming flood of data that swept up and drowned three different entities:
Yes.
the media, the police, and one man's life.
Yep.
And Zodiac does have serial killer elements, of course, because it's about a serial killer, but it's not really about
Nope.
that. It's about media, communication systems, and procedure.
Yeah.
I've never seen a film quite as dry like this be so exciting.
Yeah, you would think like the subject matter, but because it is, it takes you unaware. I remember going to watch Zodiac for the first time, right? Like I was not expecting that at all. Just the fact that I was like, okay, maybe we follow one guy, maybe we, see like maybe there'll be parts of obsession there, but the overwhelming amount of information that comes in, the ridiculous number of calls that they have to do is when they ask for tips, right? The crushing amount of just suspects that they need to kind of sort out and all of that, right? Like none of that was something I expected when I watched Zodiac for the first time. And every time I rewatch it, it strikes me as clinical in such a strange way, right? Like to say that this overwhelming amount of information is clinical is weird and paradoxical. But it is poised to be evocative, right? Of just like an overwhelming of your senses and your mind's ability to process that while you are watching the movie.
Yep.
Um,
Yep. I think that's the most special part of Zodiac. Why I find it to be so hard to convince people to watch Zodiac, because the description of it sounds so boring.
Yeah.
But it's not. It's not. Yeah. And it proves that you can wrench out good drama from good detective procedure. You know,
for sure.
Which is something that I think a lot of detective films, including the Batman, seem to don't do as successfully. I'm not going to say they're all failures, but none of them are as successful as Zodiac, I think. Yeah.
I mean, even we go with the next nearest kind of like recent thing, like Mindhunter, right? You don't get the same kind of finesse with that. Which I think is unfortunate because it's promising in so many ways.
Yeah. It has a very unconventional 3-act structure also.
Yes.
Because all three parts are basically divided by time periods, and Zodiac isn't even concerned with giving you a strong sympathetic hero. They're more concerned with observing characters in their operative roles in a larger phenomena, which is the consumption of media. And it's fascinating. I've never seen a film like Zodiac, and I don't think I will ever see again because it's tough to make. The closest I can, and they're not one-to-one comparisons. It's very apples and oranges, but I think David Simon does something similar with his shows as well, when he kind of investigates ecosystems of fringe communities.
Right.
It's something that David Simon does really well and really taps into in the way that Zodiac does. And that's the closest comparison I can get. Any last thoughts on Se7en or Zodiac before we move on?
Oh man, again, guys, readily available. Se7en and Zodiac are both on Netflix as well. If you haven't caught them or you haven't watched them in a while, and you've just watched the Batman, you can go check it out and see what we're talking about, and hopefully you guys have your own kind of like thoughts and opinions about that.
Definitely. For our final topic, we'll talk about some of the recommendations from this April. What have you seen recently or read or listened to that you want to shout out?
Yeah, so I just recently caught a couple of days ago the first episode of Spy X Family, which is a new anime this season that is...
I've seen it too.
Yeah, it's one of the new ones that have gotten the Netflix release, right? That very coveted Netflix release special. I believe I've shouted it out before, but watching the first episode, I've gone back and I just like binged through the manga itself. It's been one of my favorite kind of pickups over the last couple of years. And I'm so excited to see it being brought to life. It is an amazing kind of like comedy of misfits. And I will definitely be covering that as one of my top picks. Because one episode in, I'm sold. I went and read through. I think I'm like 80% through the manga already over the last couple of days. So please go check that out. First episode is up. It will be a weekly release on Netflix. Of course, you
Mm-hmm.
anime heads there know where to get your anime fixes, so go ahead and do that. I'll talk
Yep.
about it in more detail in our upcoming anime corner whenever that will be.
Nice, nice. Is that it, or do you have more recommendations too?
I think that's kind of it for now. I haven't really touched on anything else. I think is worth recommending recently that we're
Okay,
not
cool.
already covering sometime soon. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I believe it's just called Spy Family, right? The X is
yeah,
silent, like Hunter x
yeah,
Hunter.
yeah.
Okay, okay. One of the recent releases that I was really into is a film called Apollo 10 and a Half, which is out on
Oh
Netflix.
yes, I've got
It's
that. Mhm.
Richard Linklater's latest rotoscope film. Not latest, like his follow up to A Scanner
Yeah.
Darkly, and it plays as like part historical memoir, a home video of his real life experiences growing up in Houston, Texas, in the '60s, in the late '60s, right on the cusp of America's first moon landing.
Yep.
It's an amazing little bit of, I don't know what to call it. It's almost like anthropology. Like he immerses you into the life and details and pop culture of what it's like to be alive at that point.
Hmm.
Especially in a small little town where the moon race or the space race was such a big deal.
Yeah.
Everyone worked for NASA. It's a nice little slice of life home video type of thing that is kind of mixed with the fantasies of a small boy wondering what if he was also an astronaut.
Yeah.
Next up, I want to recommend a movie that is out in cinemas this Thursday. It's called Come On, Come On.
Yes.
We'll talk more about that in our top 10 films of the mid-year. Come On, Come On. All due respect to Joker is Joaquin Phoenix's best performance, I feel.
Yeah.
He plays an NPR type radio journalist who travels around America interviewing children about what they think their future will be.
Mhm.
One day he is forced to take care of his nephew, a small little child whose mother has to go away to take care of their dad, who is mentally ill. So he takes the son around, not the son, sorry. He takes the nephew around in a cross country journey across America
Yeah.
while he does his interview and gets to know his nephew, like, in a way that he never has before. A very humane, intimate drama of the ilk that we very rarely see these days. I'll talk more about that when it comes along.
Yeah.
I want to shout out A Sun, which got big hype back in 2020. I finally watched it. It is this Taiwanese film called A Sun. It's by Chung Mong Hong. One of the most wrenching and emotionally complex cinematics experiences I've ever encountered. It's a Taiwanese masterpiece that tells the story of two sons. One is a top medical school student. The other is the raging delinquent in juvenile detention. One son is obviously a source of pride, and the other is a source of shame for their parents. But neither are as black and white as they seem.
Yeah.
It is part family drama, part crime thriller. The movie is pure poetry. It's an astonishing film that questions whether people are capable of change and whether we can change people's impressions of us if we do change.
Yep.
Have you ever seen The Sun? It came out a couple of years ago.
I have not. I've only been reading the stuff that you've been posting up. I've already bookmarked it for whenever I have time to watch it.
Nice. Because of A Sun, I caught up with Chung Mong Hong's more recent release, just released this year in 2022. It's called The Falls.
Yeah.
It is set in Taiwan in 2020. It's kind of this intimate film that examines the fissures in the relationship between the mother and her daughter as they're quarantining in the beginning of the COVID pandemic. As financial and personal pressures set in, the mom begins suffering from a nervous breakdown or possibly a psychotic break from reality, in turn forcing the daughter to take care for her mother's deteriorating mental health. Chung Mong Hong is really becoming a must-see filmmaker for me, and I really, really loved his quietly profound domestic dramas. They're some of the best around there. Those are the film recommendations. Me and Isa will be watching Nick Cage's latest film, The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, in which Nicolas Cage plays himself as a struggling actor who is forced to um, remember or delve into past roles for a CIA mission. It sounds wild. It sounds funny. And we'll get into that soon, I'm assuming. Finally, we have some TV recommendations. Atlanta, after a 4-year absence hiatus, is back for season 3. Finally, it is better than ever. It is hilarious. Barry, a show that we've also covered here on Behold, is back for season 3 as well next week. Check it out. Better Call Saul is also back for its final season next week too. So April is a big month for some of our favorite shows. We'll talk more about other stuff that's coming back, like Undone and Russian Doll, on this upcoming episode on genre equality. But yeah, I did want to shout out Atlanta, Better Call Saul, and Barry, which are
Yes.
back. You know.
Yes.
Have you caught any of Atlanta? I know Better Call Saul and Barry premieres next week, but
I've
have you seen
only
any?
caught the first episode so far.
Which features no Atlanta characters.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, but excited to kind of we talked about like what the following episodes are in person
Mhm.
recently. So like definitely gonna do that. Actually, I want to
Yep.
shout out, guys, if you're looking for a sad clown show to watch, go watch Baskets instead. Yeah, we've covered Basket before on another episode with Ho. Please go check that out. I
Definitely.
have been trying to keep up with Moon Knight. Basically, I've dug up the old issues of Moon Knight just to kind of like have a comparison as the episodes are airing week by week. Yeah, so
Yeah. Speaking of, Atlanta and baskets, Better Things also ends this month.
ooh,
It's also its final season. Also, do check it out. I won't delve into that, and I'll point you to our Behold episode where we talk about all 3 shows
yes, at one go,
already
yeah.
at one go. So yeah, it was our FX special. If you scroll down on our timeline, you'll definitely find that one. Till next time, guys. This has been Hit
I'm
Zero.
Isa.
Goodbye.
Bye.